The town of Brookside had an eerie feeling to it at dawn. Long shadows from the streetlights stretched across the cracked pavement, and a faint mist clung to the edges of the empty sidewalks like an unwelcome visitor. The weather was cold, and Officer Jake Connors pulled his jacket tighter around himself as he sat in his patrol car, squinting against the dim light of early morning. His radio crackled softly with the usual patrol chatter. A traffic stop here, a report of a missing pet there, but nothing important. It was the kind of morning he both liked and despised. Jake didn't mind the quiet patrol. After all, it was better than the chaos that sometimes came with patrolling in the more urban parts of the county. But there was something he found deeply frustrating about these quiet mornings, too. He felt a need to be alert, to be ready for anything. And this particular morning, he was itching for action, for something, anything at all to happen. His eyes drifted to the convenience store at the edge of the block. It was one of the few places open this early. As he scanned the storefront, something caught his attention. A man standing just outside, scrolling through his phone. Jake narrowed his gaze as he tried to figure out what the man was doing so early in the morning. The man was black, dressed in a dark blazer and well-fitted slacks, a polished look that was at odds with the setting of the corner store. To Jake, something felt off. "Who stands around in a suit at a place like this, at this hour?" he muttered to himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong here, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. His years of experience had taught him to trust his gut, and his gut was telling him this black man was up to no good. With a subtle sigh, Jake turned on his patrol lights and slowly pulled up in front of the store. The man looked up, trying to squint through the sudden glare of the police headlights. He glanced at the police cruiser for a second before lowering his gaze back to his phone. Jake felt a surge of irritation at the man's apparent indifference. He stepped out of the car and adjusted his belt with a practiced motion. Jake squared his shoulders, trying to muster every air of authority he had in him as he approached. "Excuse me, sir," Jake called out, his tone firm but restrained. "Mind telling me what you're doing here this early?" The man looked up from his phone, his expression calm but slightly confused. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm with a hint of surprise in his tone. Jake caught himself frowning. He was used to a little more hesitation, maybe even a touch of fear from people he questioned. But this man's composure felt controlled, almost defiant, though there was nothing explicitly disrespectful in his response. It set Jake on edge. "I asked what you're doing here," Jake replied, his tone sounding cold. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. I just need to know what brings you out here this morning." The man slipped his phone into his pocket and took a slow, deliberate breath. "I'm on my way to work, officer," he said simply. Jake raised an eyebrow, feeling a surge of doubt at the man's calmness. He sized him up and down, searching for some crack in the composure, something to indicate a guilty conscience. The man's face held an unreadable expression that made him uncomfortable. "Mind showing me some ID?" Jake asked, slowly moving his hand a hair's breadth away from his baton. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed Jake his driver's license without a word. Jake held it up to the dim light, scanning the name Anthony Rivers. "You got a reason to be standing out here, Mr. Rivers?" Jake asked again, tilting his head slightly. He could feel his voice growing sharper, though he kept his tone in check. Rivers took a calm, steady breath before responding. "Like I said, officer, I'm just on my way to work. I stopped to check my messages. Is there something specific you're concerned about?" Jake felt a flash of irritation at the question. He was the officer here. He was the one who asked questions. Yet, the man's composed responses, the unyielding calm in his eyes, made Jake feel somehow smaller, as though he were being tested. "Look," Jake said, his voice taking on a hardened edge. "I don't need to explain myself to you. You're out here, loitering around very early in the morning. That's suspicious behavior. Now either you're going to cooperate, or we're going to have a problem." The tension in the atmosphere seemed to have gotten extremely intense. Rivers held Jake's gaze, a hint of something flashing in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe? Amusement? It was impossible to tell. Slowly, Rivers extended his hands, palms open, in a gesture that could be seen as either compliance or challenge, depending on how you chose to interpret it. "Officer," he said quietly, his tone calm, "I'm not causing any trouble. But if you feel the need to go further with this, that's your choice." Jake's jaw clenched as he balled his palms into fists by his sides. He felt as though he were being backed into a corner, forced to choose between conceding or pushing forward. The logic of the moment slipped away, clouded by his mounting frustration and a growing sense of prejudice. This man wasn't acting like someone who respected authority. He was acting like he was above it. And that, Jake thought, was something he could not let stand. Jake took a slow, deliberate step closer, his hand still resting on his belt. He could feel his heartbeat beating loudly against his chest. He looked Rivers up and down, his narrowed eyes scrutinizing the man's every feature, every slight movement, searching for anything that would justify that this man was up to no good. "So, just standing out here checking your phone, huh?" Jake said, his voice thick with skepticism. "You don't think that looks a little odd?" Rivers raised an eyebrow. "I'd imagine a lot of people check their phones while they're on their way to work," he replied, his tone neutral. "Does that usually look odd to you, officer?" Jake felt his irritation spike again. This guy wasn't supposed to question him. People didn't usually look him in the eye like that, with that much confidence, as if they were the ones in control. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I don't have to explain myself," he said, his tone taking on a threatening edge. "When I see someone hanging around like this, especially at an hour when nobody else is around, I have a right to check them out." "Officer, I appreciate the fact you're doing your job," Rivers said slowly, each word measured. "But I assure you, there's nothing suspicious about a man in a suit on his way to work." Jake clenched his jaw. The audacity of this man, standing there in his blazer and dress shoes, talking down to him as if he were the one with authority. Didn't he see who was in charge here? Jake felt a surge of anger. His pride hurt from Rivers's calm responses that felt almost mocking. "Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job?" Jake asked, leaning in slightly. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, the instinct to put this man in his place. "I don't think you understand, sir. This isn't a debate. I'm the law here, and when I ask a question, I expect a straight answer." Rivers took a deep breath. "With all due respect, officer, I've given you the answers you've asked for. Now, if you'd like to continue this conversation, I'd appreciate a bit more respect." Jake felt his fists clench. Did this black man not realize he was a sworn officer of the law? Jake wondered to himself. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about this man's presence that felt defiant, and he hated it. "I don't think you're in any position to be asking for respect," Jake snapped, his voice louder now. "I'm starting to think you're hiding something. Maybe you're out here scoping the place out, maybe planning something. Who knows?" Rivers' expression remained unreadable. "Officer," Rivers said slowly, his tone carrying the same calm authority it had from the start. "If there's anything you feel I haven't been clear about, I'd be happy to clarify. But as I said before, I'm simply on my way to work." Jake scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. He was done playing games. This guy thought he could outsmart him, thought he could slip by with his smooth talk and his calm composure. But not today. "All right, smart guy," Jake said, reaching for his radio. "You're going to have to come with me to the station. Maybe a little time in a holding cell will help you remember how to answer questions properly." A slight frown crossed Rivers' face, but he remained still. "Officer, is that really necessary? I've told you everything you need to know." "It's necessary because I say it is," Jake shot back. "I don't know who you think you are, walking around like you own the place, but in this town, you don't get to ignore the police." There was a long, tense silence. Jake watched as Rivers took a slow breath, his gaze steady, almost as if he were assessing him. Finally, Rivers nodded and held his hands out in front of him, his wrists together in silent submission. "If that's what you feel is necessary, officer, then I'll comply." The gesture struck Jake like a punch to the gut. There was no panic, no pleading. It was almost as if Rivers were indulging him, as though this were all part of some bigger game that Jake couldn't see. "Turn around," Jake ordered. Rivers compiled without a word, his movements calm and slow, as though he had nothing to fear. Jake pulled out his cuffs, securing them around Rivers' wrists. As he led Rivers toward the patrol car, Jake could see that a small crowd was gathering. He could see phones lifted, recording the scene, capturing every moment as he escorted Rivers to the car. Jake felt a flash of irritation at the onlookers, a resentment he couldn't quite suppress. Did they really think he was in the wrong? Did they really think he was doing this without reason? He glanced at Rivers, who was looking straight ahead, his face a mask of calm. The lack of fear and the lack of resistance all felt strange to Jake, but the deed was already done. "Get in," Jake muttered, shoving Rivers into the back seat of the patrol car. He climbed in himself, slamming the door harder than necessary. Jake couldn't explain the uncomfortable feeling that had grown since the moment he'd laid eyes on Rivers. But there was no going back now. He'd made his choice, and he would see it through. He had arrested people for far less, and this man wouldn't be the last. Jake shot one last glance in the rearview mirror. Rivers' eyes met his in the reflection, steady and calm, with that same unreadable look, a look that sent a chill down Jake's spine. The police station was alive with the usual morning energy that came with fresh coffee and the shifting of night duty officers making their way out the door. Jake felt his jaw tighten as he escorted Rivers through the entryway. He walked slowly with his grip firm on Rivers' arm. "Keep moving," Jake muttered, leading Rivers down a narrow hallway lined with holding cells and processing rooms. As they reached an empty room, Jake swung the door open and gestured for Rivers to enter. Rivers stepped inside. He looked around calmly and then took a seat in the metal chair at the center of the room, crossing his legs in a manner that seemed almost out of place in the harsh fluorescent light. Jake tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling as he shut the door behind them and moved toward the desk, where a few sheets of paperwork were waiting. He grabbed a pen, tapping it absently against the paper. He looked up at Rivers, who sat watching him with a faint smile tugging on his lips. "All right," Jake said, his voice gruff as he began to fill out the form. "Name?" Rivers' eyebrows lifted just slightly. "I believe you already have that, officer." Jake's hand paused for a second before he forced himself to continue writing, willing himself to ignore the anxiety and doubt that Rivers' calm tone had stirred. "Just answer the questions," he replied coldly. "Address?" "Check the driver's license," Rivers replied absent-mindedly. There was a hint of amusement in his voice. It was subtle, but unmistakable. "Look, you're not helping yourself by being difficult," Jake snapped, the pen in his hand digging into the paper. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this isn't the time for jokes." Rivers leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Officer, I've been nothing but cooperative," he said smoothly. "But if you feel I'm being difficult, maybe it's because you're not asking the right questions." Jake's patience was wearing thin. He was used to people obeying him, to people respecting his authority. But this man, this smug, calm, suited man, seemed immune to the usual rules. It was as if the usual intimidation tactics didn't apply here, and that realization left Jake feeling more shaken than he cared to admit. He loved to be in power in situations like this. "What exactly are you implying?" Jake demanded, his voice now filled with frustration. Rivers gave him a small shrug. "Nothing at all, officer. I'm simply suggesting that perhaps you should think carefully about the situation you've created here." There was a sudden knock on the door, and Jake got up angrily, quickly sliding the door open. Outside stood Officer Lopez, a younger officer who had joined the department just a few years back. Officer Jake?" Lopez said, his voice cracking. "Captain wants to see you in his office, right away." Jake felt slightly annoyed at the interruption. "I'm a little busy right now," he replied, his voice sharp. Lopez swallowed, glancing nervously toward Rivers. Jake watched Lopez's eyes go wide with disbelief as if he knew Rivers from somewhere. Lopez took a half step back as he realized who the man in the holding cell was. "Look, Jake," Lopez stammered, his voice laced with urgency. "You really need to go talk to the captain, now." Jake hesitated for a minute. He glanced back at Rivers, who was watching the interaction with a more evident smile now. "Fine," Jake muttered, casting one last glare at Rivers before stepping out of the room. He shot a warning look at Lopez, who seemed rooted to the spot, still staring at Rivers with an expression of shock and awe. As Jake made his way down the hall toward the captain's office, his mind was trying to understand what was going on. What had Lopez seen that he hadn't? Why had Lopez reacted like that, as if Rivers was someone important? He shook his head, dismissing the thought. This was just a routine check. There was nothing special about this man, just another black man with an attitude who thought he was above the law. When Jake reached the captain's office, he knocked twice before entering. Captain Hayward looked up from his desk and gestured for Jake to sit. Jake had known their captain for over a decade now, and he could immediately tell something was off. "What's going on?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was in the middle of processing a suspect." Captain Hayward's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "Jake," he said, his tone calm, but laced with a tension that made Jake's stomach turn. "Do you have any idea who you just brought into this station?" Jake frowned, the question catching him off guard. He didn't have any ID other than a driver's license. He said his name was Anthony Rivers." Jake shrugged. "He looked suspicious, hanging around a store at dawn. I figured he might be involved in something." Captain Hayward's face twisted in anger, and he took a slow breath as though trying to gather himself. "Anthony Rivers is the chief of police for the city," he said, his voice heavy with barely contained anger. "He's your superior, Jake. You just arrested the chief of police." The words hit Jake like a slap. That can't be right," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't say anything. He just stood there like he was expecting you to figure it out?" Hayward interrupted, his tone cold. "Well, maybe he was. Or maybe he just didn't feel the need to spell it out for you. Either way, Jake, you've just made one of the biggest mistakes of your career." Jake felt the room spin, his heart pounding as the weight of his actions crashed over him. Rivers wasn't some random guy, some nameless suspect he could toss into a cell without thought or consequence. He was the chief of police, a man with authority, respect, and a reputation that far exceeded Jake's. And he had just humiliated him, treated him like a common criminal, all because he'd let his assumptions cloud his judgment. I didn't know," Jake said weakly, his voice barely audible. "He didn't tell me. He just—" Captain Hayward shook his head, his expression hardening. "That's not the point, Jake. The point is that you saw a man standing on the street, a black man, in a suit, minding his own business, and you decided he was guilty of something. You made an assumption, and now you're going to have to deal with whatever comes from this situation." Jake felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, the reality of his mistake sinking in with brutal clarity. He thought back to the way he had spoken to Rivers, the way he had demanded answers, the way he had cuffed him without a second thought, all because he'd seen what he wanted to see instead of the truth. What do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The captain's gaze hardened. "For starters, you're going to go back to that room and apologize to Chief Rivers. After that, we'll discuss disciplinary actions. But Jake, understand this. Your career is on the line. I don't know if you'll be able to recover from this." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Jake nodded slowly. He was just starting to realize the depth of his mistake. Jake felt as if he was walking to his room as he approached the room where Chief Rivers waited. Each step seemed to echo down the hall, the sound carrying a weight that pressed against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He paused just outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle, paralyzed by the thought of what waited on the other side. He was about to apologize to the chief of police, a man he'd just handcuffed and paraded through the station like a common criminal. He tried to think of excuses he could give to get out of this mess, but the magnitude of his mistake was starting to close in like a noose. The department's highest-ranking officer had been under his custody, treated like a suspect, all because Jake hadn't looked past his prejudices. He forced himself to take a slow, deep breath before he pushed the door open. Inside the processing room, Chief Rivers sat on the cold metal chair with his hands still resting on the table. His gaze was steady as he looked up, his eyes revealing none of the anger or humiliation that Jake expected to find there. Jake hesitated, struggling to meet Rivers' eyes. He could feel the heat of his embarrassment burning on his cheeks, the shame of his actions bearing down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. Chief Rivers?" he stammered, his voice thick with a mix of panic and remorse. I had no idea. I didn't know it was you." Rivers stared at him with a blank expression. Jake shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other, as Rivers just maintained a steady, piercing gaze on him. "I see," Rivers replied finally, his voice calm but laced with a subtle edge. "And what exactly did you think I was? A threat? A criminal?" Jake swallowed, his throat tight, each word feeling like a confession. "Sir, I thought you looked suspicious. I thought—" His voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, the weight of his assumptions settling heavily in his chest. The truth was obvious, and Jake couldn't deny it. Chief Rivers leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "You saw a black man standing on the street, and that was all it took to make him suspicious. That's what you thought, Officer Jake, isn't it?" The words were delivered calmly, but their impact was devastating. Jake flinched, feeling the sting of his actions laid bare, stripped of any excuses. He had seen what he wanted to see, ignoring everything else: Rivers' polished appearance, his respectful tone, his obvious composure. All he had seen was a black man, and he immediately made up his mind that he was up to no good. "Yes, sir," Jake admitted quietly, the words scraping against his pride, his voice a low murmur. I'm sorry. I made a mistake." Rivers held his gaze, his expression softening in a way that hinted at understanding, or perhaps pity. "And what would you have done, Officer Jake, if I had resisted? What if I hadn't complied with your orders?" The question struck Jake like a blow, forcing him to confront the depths of his assumptions. He realized, with a sickening twist in his gut, that he hadn't considered the possibility of Rivers resisting because he'd already assumed his power in the situation. He had assumed control and authority. And, had Rivers done anything else? He knew he would have escalated the situation without hesitation. His mind played out the scene as it might have gone, the horrifying reality of it settling in with cold clarity. "I don't know, sir," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. I wasn't thinking." Rivers nodded slowly. "That's the problem, Officer Jake. Too many officers don't think. They act on instinct, on assumption, and too often, those assumptions are wrong." Jake felt his stomach twist with guilt, each word from Rivers peeling back another layer of his actions, exposing the painful truth beneath. He wanted to say something, to explain himself, to find some way to redeem his actions, but he knew there was nothing he could say to undo the damage he had done. "There's something you should understand, Officer Jake," Rivers continued, his tone calm but firm. "Authority isn't just about wearing a badge and carrying a gun. It's about respect, responsibility, and, most of all, accountability. The uniform doesn't give you the right to make snap judgments about people based on nothing more than a glance." Jake nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet Rivers' gaze. He felt the weight of the chief's words pressing down on him, each one sinking into his conscience like a stone. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who did his job well, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed, not just as an officer, but as a person. "Sir, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right," he said finally, his voice hoarse with remorse. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I'll take whatever punishment you see fit." Rivers studied him for a moment. "Making this right isn't just about punishment, officer. It's about understanding why this happened and making sure it doesn't happen again. This isn't just about one mistake. It's about a pattern, a way of thinking that's deeply embedded in this department and in law enforcement as a whole." The words hit Jake hard, the implications settling heavily in his mind. He had always thought of himself as a fair officer, someone who upheld the law without bias, but now he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. His actions weren't just the result of a single mistake. They were part of a much larger issue, a systemic problem that went beyond himself. He felt embarrassed as he realized that he had become part of something he had never questioned. Rivers leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. "You're going to be suspended, Officer Jake. Pending a full investigation, we'll determine the final disciplinary actions. In the meantime, I suggest you spend some time reflecting on the role you play as a police officer and what it means to hold that responsibility." Jake nodded numbly, feeling the weight of his punishment settling heavily on his shoulders. The suspension felt like a small price to pay compared to the damage he had caused, but he knew there was no way to take back the whole situation. He would carry this mistake with him, a scar that would never fully heal. Rivers rose from his chair, signaling the end of the conversation. As Rivers walked to the door, he paused, glancing back at Jake with a look that held both disappointment and a faint trace of hope. "Remember this, Officer Jake," he said, his voice low but firm. "Authority is a privilege, not a weapon. Use it wisely." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Jake to process all that had just happened. He felt hollow, and his mind kept echoing Rivers' words, the truth of them sinking in slowly and painfully. For the first time in his career, Jake saw his role as an officer through different eyes. He had always thought of himself as a protector, someone who kept the peace, but now he understood that peace wasn't just about control. It was about respect, humility, and the willingness to confront his shortcomings. As Jake left the room, he felt the eyes of his fellow officers on him. He could see the judgment and pity in their eyes, and he immediately knew that his reputation in the department had crashed. But despite all this, Jake wanted to learn from his mistake, to change, to be better. For the first time in his life, Jake found himself questioning who he was and who he wanted to become. The next few days were difficult for Officer Jake. News of the incident had spread faster than he could have imagined. It had gone from whispers among officers in the department to a full-blown story circulating the town. Everywhere he went, he could feel the weight of stares. The suspension was only the beginning. With each passing hour, it became clearer that his mistake with Chief Rivers wasn't going to be swept under the rug. The department launched an internal investigation, bringing in outside consultants to review footage of the incident, examine his past conduct, and interview other officers. Jake sat through interview after interview, each one feeling like an interrogation. The tension in the station was at an all-time high, and every officer seemed to avoid his gaze as though his mistake were somehow contagious. Outside the walls of the precinct, things were no better. Word had spread to the community, and most people in the small town had heard what happened. Jake saw it in the tense looks he got at the grocery store, in the way neighbors turned their backs on him when he walked by. The worst part, though, was the sleepless nights. Every time he closed his eyes, the memory of Chief Rivers's calm gaze would flash across his mind, a silent reminder of his prejudice. He tossed and turned, haunted by the echoes of that encounter. Jake found himself always staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the memories that had started bubbling to the surface. Fragments of past encounters played through his mind like pieces of a puzzle, each one revealing the uncomfortable truth of his behavior. He remembered a time years ago when he'd stopped a young black teenager who was riding his bike through a wealthy neighborhood. The kid hadn't done anything wrong, he was just passing through. But Jake had seen him, and something in his gut had told him the teenager was up to something bad. He had convinced himself he was just doing his job, but now he realized with a sinking feeling that there had been more to it than that. He'd seen the color of the kid's skin and assumed he didn't belong. Then there was also the woman he'd pulled over late one night simply because her car had looked out of place in a wealthy area. She had been black, too, and he'd questioned her with an edge in his voice, letting his suspicions show even though she'd done nothing wrong. He had assumed guilt where there was none, letting his biases drive his actions under the guise of protecting the community. As the memories continued to resurface, Jake felt a wave of nausea churn in his stomach. Each incident was like a small crack in his self-image, the carefully constructed idea of himself as a fair and just officer slowly crumbling away. He'd spent years believing he was one of the good guys, but now he saw the truth. He hadn't just been protecting people. He had been enforcing an unspoken standard of who belonged and who didn't, guided by biases he had never questioned. In a desperate attempt to find some comfort, he reached for his phone, scrolling through the messages from family and friends. But the responses he saw were mixed and not in the way he had hoped. The text from his brother cut him the deepest. "Jake, what were you thinking? Do you realize what this has done to Mom and Dad? This is embarrassing for the whole family." He put the phone down, the feeling of sadness enveloping him again. He'd been so wrapped up in his anger, his own need to assert control in that moment with Rivers, that he hadn't stopped to think about how his actions would affect the people around him. Now, it was too late. The damage had been done, and there was no undoing it. In the quiet of his apartment, Jake began to realize that he was losing everything he'd once held dear. His sense of purpose, his reputation, the respect of his family and community, all of it was slowly slipping through his fingers. Jake spent the next few days avoiding calls from the station. He was too ashamed to face his colleagues. He knew the disciplinary hearing was coming soon, and they were all eager to hear what had happened directly from him. Jake needed to speak to someone, anybody at all, to help with the heavy feeling that was slowly making him miserable. He decided to confide in his best friend Mike, who had been on the force with him since their academy days. They met at a quiet bar on the edge of town, where Jake nursed a drink in silence before finally opening up. It was like, "I just saw what I wanted to see," he admitted, his voice rough, barely audible over the hum of conversation around them. "I looked at him, and all I saw was a threat. I didn't even question it. I assumed." Mike looked at him. "Jake, we've all been there," he replied carefully. "You know as well as I do that the job messes with your head, makes you think everyone's hiding something. But that's no excuse, man. You've got to own up to it." Jake nodded, staring into his glass. "I know. It's just, I always thought I was better than this. Thought I was fair, that I didn't judge people. But now I'm not so sure." Mike put a hand on Jake's shoulder. "The job changes you, Jake. Makes you see things differently. But maybe this is a chance to rethink things. Look, you messed up, big time. But you don't have to let it define you. You can learn from this, or you can let it drag you down. That's your choice." Jake thought of Mike's words. He felt a small flicker of something that resembled hope. It was faint, but it was something. A small possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move forward. As he drove home that night, Jake felt quite better. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if he'd be able to repair the damage he'd caused, but he knew he had to try. The next morning he called Captain Hayward. His voice was steady as he spoke, though he could feel the nervous tremor in his hands. "Captain, I need to meet with Chief Rivers," he said, his tone firm. "I need to apologize to him properly, and I want to know what I can do to make things right." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Captain Hayward responded. "I'll set it up, Jake. But just remember, apologies are only the beginning. The real work starts after that." As he hung up, Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't hide from this any longer. If he wanted to reclaim any part of himself, he'd have to confront the truth of what he had done, and be willing to change. The meeting room was packed. Officers lined the walls, some standing shoulder to shoulder, others clustered in small groups. Everyone knew why they were here. Jake could feel the weight of eyes on him, and every glance felt like a silent judgment, a reminder of his mistakes. He stood near the back, with his gaze fixed on the floor as he waited for the meeting to begin. At the front of the room stood Chief Rivers. His expression was calm but focused, with an aura of quiet authority surrounding him. When he cleared his throat, the room fell silent, and every eye turned toward him, the anticipation thick in the air. "Thank you all for being here," Rivers began. "As many of you are aware, we had an incident last week that has raised serious concerns. Concerns not just about one officer's actions, but about the culture within our department and the role that each of us plays in shaping that culture." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of each officer as if silently challenging them to confront the reality of his words. "This isn't about singling out one officer," Rivers continued. "This is about taking a hard look at ourselves, at the choices we make, and at the assumptions that sometimes guide those choices. As officers, we're entrusted with an incredible responsibility. We are given the authority to uphold the law, to protect our communities, and to ensure justice is served. But that authority comes with an equally significant obligation: to examine ourselves and our actions, to hold ourselves accountable, and to confront any biases that may interfere with our duty. Rivers' voice was calm but intense, each word carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the room. The officers were silent as they listened attentively to what the chief was saying. "We all have biases," Rivers continued, his tone softening slightly. "They're not unique to one person, one community, or one department. Bias is something that each of us must acknowledge and work to understand. But the danger comes when we allow those biases to go unchecked, when we act on assumptions instead of evidence, and finally, when we let our perceptions cloud our judgment." Jake swallowed, his gaze fixed on Rivers as the chief's words echoed across the room. Rivers wasn't just talking to the room, he was talking to him, to the man who had made the mistake of seeing only what he wanted to see. "As officers," Rivers continued, "we need to remember that our job is not to judge people based on their appearance and race, their background, or our own expectations. Our job is to see the truth, to serve everyone in our community with fairness, respect, and integrity. And when we fail to do that, we fail the very people we are sworn to protect." Rivers glanced down, his hands resting on the podium. When he looked up again, his expression softened, carrying a note of empathy that surprised Jake. "We're human," he said, his voice lower now, almost gentle. "We make mistakes, but part of our duty is to learn from those mistakes, to let them shape us into better officers, and to use those lessons to strengthen our commitment to justice. We cannot let our mistakes define us, but we also cannot ignore them. We must face them, own them, and ensure they do not happen again." The room was silent, the tension now replaced by a collective agreement to what was being said. Jake could feel the shift in the air, a subtle change as his fellow officers listened, really listened, to what Rivers was saying. Rivers straightened, his gaze sweeping across the room one last time. "This department has a long way to go. Change isn't going to happen overnight, and it isn't going to happen without each of you making a conscious effort to confront your own biases and make better choices. But I believe we can be better. I believe that each of you has the potential to become not just good officers, but better people." He paused to let the words settle and enable the officers to understand the weight of his challenge. "Remember this: we are only as strong as our commitment to justice, and justice cannot thrive without empathy, accountability, and respect. I hope each of you will take this to heart and carry it with you every day, in every encounter, and in every choice you make." With that, Rivers stepped back, signaling the end of the meeting. The room remained silent, the officers deep in thought, processing the gravity of what they had just heard. Slowly, the officers broke out in a standing ovation for what the chief had just said. The meeting ended, and the officers left for their duties, with each promising to make conscious effort to control their bias. Jake lingered at the back of the room, watching Rivers as he gathered his things. He knew he wasn't the only one who had been affected by Rivers' words, but for him, the message had been deeply personal, a reflection of the painful truth he was now forced to confront. As he watched Rivers walk away, Jake felt extremely determined. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could change himself. He didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know if he could repair the damage he had done, but he knew one thing: he would try. Jake understood that redemption wasn't about undoing the past, it was about learning from it, about finding a way to move forward with integrity and humility. As he left the room, the echoes of Rivers' words stayed with him, a quiet reminder that change was possible, if he was willing to work for it. The backlash from the incident was relentless, sweeping the streets, neighborhoods, and social media feeds. What had started as idle gossip had turned into a full-blown conversation about police practices, race, and accountability, with Officer Jake at the center of it all. People who once greeted him with friendly nods now looked at him with narrowed eyes, their trust in him shattered by that single, irrevocable act. It didn't take long for the story to make local headlines. Articles dissected every detail, speculating on the deeper issues in Brookside's police department. Jake found his name splashed across news feeds, with phrases like racial profiling and abuse of power attached to it. Each headline, each mention, felt like a fresh blow, each word carving away another piece of his reputation. Jake couldn't even go to the grocery store easily anymore. He noticed that the cashier, a young woman who had always been friendly, barely looked him in the eye. In the aisles, he could feel the weight of the stares. A mother in the produce section turned her child away from him, murmuring something that he couldn't hear but felt from her expression. As he walked out, a voice cut through the silence. "How does it feel, officer? To know that your kind judge people just for being black?" He turned, catching sight of a man standing at the edge of the parking lot, his arms crossed. Jake felt his stomach twist, the shame and anger swirling within him as he forced himself to look away. He wanted to say something, to explain himself, to somehow defend his actions, but he knew there was no justification. Nothing he could say would erase the truth of what he had done. The whispers and accusations weren't just from strangers either. His family had been caught in the crossfire, dodging uncomfortable questions and dealing with the fallout of his mistake. His father, a retired police officer, had called him with his voice heavy with disappointment. "Jake," his father had said, the words slow and deliberate, "I raised you better than this. I taught you to be fair and respect everyone, no matter where they're from or what they look like. What happened?" Jake had no answer. He sat in silence, the weight of his father's disappointment settling over him, leaving him feeling like a boy caught in a lie, exposed and ashamed. As the days went on, the backlash only became worse. Local activists began calling for increased accountability, urging the police department to implement anti-bias training and stricter policies around racial profiling. Community meetings were held, each one filled with angry voices demanding answers, demanding change. Jake stayed home during those meetings, too ashamed to face the public, knowing he was the reason for their anger. One night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories of past encounters filtering through his mind with relentless clarity. He saw himself from the outside, each moment playing like a scene in a movie. A police officer approaching people with suspicion, judging them before they had even spoken, assuming guilt without evidence. Each memory brought a fresh wave of guilt, the realization of his own biases unfolding with brutal clarity. He had prided himself on being a protector of the community, a fair and responsible officer, but now he saw the truth. He had been deciding who belonged and who didn't, based on little more than appearance. The realization was a bitter reminder of how easily he had failed the very principles he'd sworn to uphold. Desperate to understand himself better, Jake began reading articles and essays on racial bias in policing, focusing on perspectives he had previously dismissed or ignored. He read accounts from people of color, describing encounters with police that mirrored his actions. Each story was like a mirror, reflecting his own behavior and forcing him to confront the pain he had caused in ways he had never fully understood. One story in particular stood out. It was an essay written by a black man who described the experience of living with the constant fear of being profiled and the anxiety of walking through neighborhoods where he was seen as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. The man spoke of the exhaustion, the frustration, the resentment of always being seen as guilty until proven innocent. Jake felt the words sink into him, each sentence a reminder of the way he had treated others like this man. For the first time, he truly understood the impact of his actions, not just on Chief Rivers, but on every person he had ever judged unfairly. Knowing what he knew now, Jake felt ashamed of his past actions. But there was something else. He realized there was this persistent determination to do better. He didn't know if he could ever make things right, but he knew he couldn't ignore the truth of what he had learned. He couldn't go back to the way things were, couldn't pretend he hadn't seen the harm he had caused. That evening, he decided to attend a community meeting. He sat quietly at the back, slipping into a seat in the shadows, hoping to avoid drawing attention. The room was packed, people standing along the walls, voices murmuring with barely restrained anger and frustration. At the front, a woman was speaking, her voice filled with conviction as she described the need for real change, for officers to be held accountable for their biases. "We can't keep living like this," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. We can't keep pretending that these incidents are isolated, that they don't reflect a bigger problem. This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that allows these biases to go unchecked, that allows people to be judged, mistreated, and even killed because of the color of their skin. The crowd murmured in agreement, the energy in the room a powerful force. Jake felt a knot tighten in his chest, each word driving home the reality of what he had done. For a moment he considered leaving, slipping out before anyone had a chance to confront him. But he had decided he would stop running and hiding. He stayed, listening to each speaker, absorbing their words, letting them sink into him with a painful honesty that he knew he needed to face. As the meeting ended, Jake lingered near the exit, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He felt a presence beside him and looked up to find the woman who had been speaking earlier, watching him with an intense gaze. "You were the officer, weren't you?" she asked, her tone steady, without a trace of malice. "The one who arrested Chief Rivers." Jake nodded. "Yes, that was me." She studied him for a moment. "I appreciate that you showed up tonight," she said finally. "But showing up is just the start. The real question is, what are you going to do next?" Jake felt the weight of her words settle over him, a challenge he couldn't ignore. He didn't have an answer yet, and didn't know exactly what the path forward looked like. But he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't ignore the truth of what he had done or the responsibility he had. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'm going to figure it out." She nodded, a faint glimmer of respect in her eyes. "Then I hope, for your sake, that you do." As he left the meeting, Jake felt a strange sense of clarity. He was more determined than ever to make things right, not just for himself, but for the people he had wronged. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he was done hiding, done pretending. He was ready to face his mistakes, to learn, to change. Will you take the first step toward a more just and understanding world? I do love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have a wonderful day.